Picture a night sky over southern Africa, roughly 180,000 years ago. No cities, no lights, no engines or anything built by civilization. Just the Milky Way burning across the darkness like a river of sparks. Under that sky, a handful of early humans sit around a fire. Their world is narrow, just a few families in a pocket of livable land surrounded by drought, predators, and uncertainty. They have no idea anyone will ever give a name to their mitochondrial lineage. They don't know that tens of thousands of years in the future, their distant descendants will map out the maternal branches of the human family tree and call one of those branches L0. But whether they knew it or not, the women carrying that lineage were anchoring the opening chapter of the human maternal story. To understand L0, you first have to understand what mitochondria actually are. Most people call them the power centers of the cell. That's fine, but for our purposes, think of them as tiny biological passports stamped only by mothers. You inherit your mitochondria from your mother. Your mother got hers from her mother. And that chain of inheritance runs backward through time, unbroken, through countless generations of women across ice ages, migrations, droughts, wars, famines, and all the close calls that tried to erase us. While the rest of your DNA is shuffled every generation, mixed and remixed by sexual reproduction, your mitochondrial DNA is remarkably conservative. It changes, but slowly, and in small, trackable steps. When scientists compare mitochondrial DNA across the world, patterns appear. Similar sequences group into clusters, haplogroups, branches on a worldwide maternal family tree. Some clusters are common in Europe, some in East Asia, some among indigenous peoples of the Americas, others in Oceania and across Africa. And when you trace those clusters back far enough, something remarkable happens. They converge on a single woman. She wasn't the first woman. She wasn't the only woman alive at the time. She's simply the one whose daughter-to-daughter line never died out. Every other purely maternal line, over tens of thousands of years, eventually hit a dead end. No daughters, no continuation. Hers didn't. That statistical anchor point is what we call Mitochondrial Eve. If Eve is the point where the tree begins, L0 is one of the first strong roots that grips the earth. It's not the only root, but it's one of the oldest that still lives. When geneticists reconstruct the maternal tree, they see that humanity's mitochondrial diversity splits early into two great trunks. One of them is L0. The other contains the rest of the L haplogroups, L1, L2, L3, and beyond. From those later branches, especially L3, will come all the maternal lines that eventually leave Africa and spread across the globe. But L0 stays close to the base, like an ancient root gripping the bedrock of humanity. Its main branches are L0D, the oldest, starting around 145,000 years ago, common among Khoisan people, plus L0K, L0A, L0B, and L0F. These spread across Africa, carrying more ancient variety than L1 groups in the West, or L3 lines that later left Africa. To understand what that means, you have to step into the world where L0 formed. Africa back then wasn't the peaceful cradle people like to imagine in coffee table books. It was a continent under environmental stress. Climate records tell us there were waves of megadrought, periods when huge regions dried out, lakes shrank or vanished, animals died off, and green land shrank into small, scattered refuges. Habitable zones came and went like flickering lights. Imagine humanity not as a rising, continent-spanning species, but as a fragile network of survival camps. A dozen people by a shrinking lake, a few hundred along a coastline still offering shellfish when the inland was dying, a small group clustered along a river where groundwater still reached the surface. If you could see us from space at that time and highlight every human, we wouldn't look like a glowing continent. We would look like a sparse constellation, tiny points of light, surrounded by vast stretches of darkness. And in that darkness, entire family lines were disappearing, not through mythology or epic battle, but quietly, running out of food, losing too many children, being swallowed by drought, or losing just enough daughters that a maternal line stopped, unnoticed. That's the world where L0 took shape. When we say L0 arose around 180,000 to 200,000 years ago, it sounds like a clean timestamp from a lab. But what it really means is that, in at least one of those fragile pockets of early Homo sapiens, the women who survived long enough to have surviving daughters just happened, statistically over thousands of years, to share a particular mitochondrial pattern. That pattern, passed from mother to child, slowly built up tiny changes, like key switches called T195C and A2706G in the ND5 and COI genes. These are like DNA fingerprints that make L0 different from later branches. L1 has its own marker called Y496H, and L3 has others, marking L0 as its own unique line on the family tree. It didn't grant superpowers. It simply didn't fail. In deep time, that is enough. The fact that the deepest branches of L0 today are most common in southern Africa tells us something about geography. At least some of the earliest people carrying L0 lived in or near what we now call the Kalahari Basin and its surrounding landscapes, places defined by seasonal wetlands, fluctuating rivers, patches of savanna, and narrow green corridors that appeared and vanished with the climate. This was not a lush Garden of Eden. It was a dynamic, sometimes harsh mosaic of opportunities and threats. But crucially, it was stable enough in certain pockets to sustain humans when other regions could not. Archaeology in and around these regions reveals something remarkable. Not just stone tools that tell us people were cutting, scraping, hunting, and butchering, but signs of symbolic thought. Pieces of ochre engraved with deliberate patterns. Pigment mixes stored in shells, suggesting that color was prepared, saved, and used with intent, perhaps for body painting or marking objects. Beads drilled from shells and strung together, turning everyday materials into symbols of identity, status, or belonging. These are small things, easily overlooked, but they matter. They suggest that even while the climate was grinding humanity down to some of its smallest populations, some groups weren't only surviving, They were creating meaning. They were marking identity. They were building memory outside the brain. We can't point to a specific bead and say, this belonged to someone with L0. Ancient DNA rarely gives us that kind of precision so far back. But the overlap, early symbolic behavior in regions tied genetically to early L0 ancestry, paints a compelling picture. When the world tightened the vice, these people responded not just with adaptation, but with imagination. When the environment said, survive, they answered with something deeper. We'll remember. They encoded knowledge and emotion in pigments, ornaments, and maybe stories told around fires like the one we started with. So what did these early L0 people look like? If one of them stepped into the modern world dressed in contemporary clothing, you'd recognize them as fully human. Their anatomy was already modern. Their brains were large and complex, more than capable of language, planning, and creativity. Their hands could do everything ours can do: braid fibers, carve wood, shape stone, tie and untie knots, gesture, comfort, and threaten. Their skin was richly pigmented, a natural shield against intense African sunlight. Their bodies were built for endurance, not the explosive speed of a track sprinter, but the quiet, stubborn stamina of people who might walk or jog for hours to track game, carry water, or relocate camp over long distances. Physiologically, their mitochondria were doing what mitochondria always do: turning oxygen and food into ATP, the molecular fuel that powers muscles, brains, and organs. The differences that define haplogroups like L0 are subtle tweaks in that machinery, conserved changes in protein coding regions like ND5 and cytochrome genes that define L0 versus others, with no strong selection signals like some Eurasian branches, just statistical endurance through bottlenecks. L0 didn't spread because it was the best or strongest in some comic book sense. It spread because, across many generations in that time and place, it didn't falter badly enough to be pruned away by chance and hardship. Lines that couldn't handle the cumulative stresses of that world simply vanished. L0 didn't. Now fast forward the tape. The climate shifts again. Wet years return more regularly. Lakes refill. New grasslands open ancient pathways that had been closed by drought for millennia. Populations that had been isolated in their individual refuges begin to move again. A group from one basin follows a river north. Another follows a coastal route. Others radiate out across newly green corridors. When human groups meet, genes mix. Children are born with mitochondrial DNA from one group, and nuclear DNA, a blend of the rest of the genome, from many. Over time, new mitochondrial lineages appear as mutations accumulate on different branches: L1, L2, L3, L4, L5, L6. One branch of L3 will eventually push out of Africa entirely, crossing into the Middle East and expanding into Europe, Asia, and ultimately the Americas and the Pacific Islands. That means most people outside Africa today trace their maternal ancestry back through L3, not L0. But L0 doesn't vanish. It holds ground. It remains in the regions where it first took root, passed from mother to daughter, in long, unbroken lines. It also sends some branches outward within Africa, contributing to the rich diversity of African maternal lineages that predate any out-of-Africa expansion. When geneticists study mitochondrial DNA today, and find L0 most prominent in certain southern African populations, especially among groups with deep local histories, it's not because those people are ancient in some frozen-in-time sense. They are as modern, as dynamic, and as contemporary as anyone else. What it means is that their maternal line, this specific thread of ancestry, has been running continuously since close to the dawn of our species. It's a chapter that never closed, a paragraph that's still being written in the same ancestral ink. Think about what that implies on a personal scale. Every person alive today is the result of an unbroken chain of survival, stretching back through staggering odds. For your own ancestry, there were countless moments where the chain could have snapped. A disease that could have been fatal, an injury that could have been lethal in an age before hospitals, a migration that could have failed, a drought that could have lasted just a little too long. And yet, for your line, it didn't. The line held. L0 is proof that this resilience isn't just a personal story, it's a species-level story. There were times in Africa when our numbers were so low, our range so fractured, that an outside observer might reasonably have written us off as an evolutionary dead end. But the women carrying L0, alongside women carrying other early maternal lines, kept the flame alive. They fed their children, they cooperated, they shared knowledge, they buried their dead and remembered them. They read the land and the sky. They adjusted their strategies when old ones stopped working. They didn't know they were holding a species together. They were simply living as humans. But their survival echoed forward in time in a way we can now read in their descendants' cells. When we put a label on L0 and place it at the base of the human mtDNA tree, we're not just doing genetic bookkeeping. We're tracing the beginnings of human durability. Humanity became tough not during periods of abundance and comfort, but during stretches of crisis and scarcity. We became who we are because we learned to survive instability, to adapt culturally and technologically, and to carry meaning and memory with us as a form of armor. L0 isn't the only root of the human maternal tree, but it's one of the deepest, one of the quietest, and one of the most stubborn. So picture that night sky again, the Milky Way blazing overhead, the firelight flickering on faces, the small group huddled under impossible odds. They didn't know they were anchoring the future. They didn't know their mitochondrial signature would still be detectable almost 200,000 years later and given a code in some distant laboratory. They were simply doing what humans do when confronted with uncertainty, caring for their own, navigating the land, telling stories, making beauty in small, fragile ways. L0 is the reminder that when the world almost said no to our species, some of our earliest mothers answered yes, with enough force that it still echoes in our cells. Their flame didn't just survive, it spread, it branched, it intertwined with others. It became the human story. And every time we look back into the genetic record and trace that line, we are, in a sense, listening to their answer carry across the ages. We were here, we endured, and because we did, you are here now to tell this tale.